characters appearing in the Bible as are written about in the Quran. So you've essentially got, it's like a plant. You've essentially got the same soil, the same roots. It's just how you develop the plant. And as I say, I think that all the groundwork was there for me. The only thing that or the major thing that I had to get over was the business of the Holy Trinity, belief in the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost, to move from that to the belief in the one God. But when I look back, I realised that I always believed in the one God anyway.
But you'd agree that Britain is a very secular society as compared to the United States, for instance, and only 7.5% people are regular churchgoers, right? You identified yourself with that 7-8% people who actually are devoted to Christianity in this country.
Well, I wouldn't say that I was devoted. In fact, I would go as far as to say I believe in Britain today there are far more active Muslim worshippers than there are Christians in this country. And by that I mean people who turn up to church once a week compared to people who go to the mosque on a Friday. And I would be quite confident in saying that if it's not the same, it's probably more practicing Muslims in this country than there are practicing Christians.
Will it be correct to say that in the summer of 2003, when you converted to Islam, you were coming from a godless society into the world of God? You were moving from non-religion into religion, rather than moving from Christianity into Islam?
No, I was moving from one religion to another, but I actually left the Church of England first before I became a Muslim, and that was over the siege of the Nativity, when Israeli soldiers were firing on what essentially was the birthplace of Christ. And as far as Christians were concerned, this is one of the holiest places in Christendom. And the Israeli soldiers had no respect for it, and there was a statue of the Virgin Mary above the church, and they riddled that statue with bullets. Nothing behind it, you know. It was
serious?
It was just target practice, and it was.
And nothing happened.
And nothing happened. The Pope broke silence first and said, "This is despicable." The Church of England, which is the church that I belong to, said and did nothing. And I was so furious, and I thought, if my church leaders cannot even stand up and defend the birthplace of Christianity, then why on earth would they even stand to defend me? You know, I am nothing. And I just thought, I don't need to be in this gutless, spineless organisation. And I left. And I walked away from the Church of England. I wrote about it. It upset the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the, cleric-wise, the head of the church.
This is 2001?
This was 2002 or 3. 2003, I think.
It's 2003.
And I just thought, you know, I don't need to go to a church and pray through some priest to speak to God. You know, at least with Islam I can have dialect straight away. And what I loved also about Islam is that I can draw a line in the sand, and that is my mosque. That is my place of prayer. I don't need a great big fancy building or some priest with fine garments and ceremonial robes to tell me how to pray. And it's that simplicity about
when you
Islam.
Came back and appreciated Taliban, that it treated you decently, and then subsequently when you converted to Islam, many people were extremely unhappy. Some people brought the concept of the Stockholm Syndrome. They said you had fallen in love, or there was a bonding relationship between you and your captors.
Well, they were all very handsome young men, but I was terrified of them the whole time. And I certainly didn't bond with them. I spat at them, I swore at them, I refused to cooperate with them, I shouted at them, I threw things at them. I refused to eat their food, which really hurt them. And
why you refused eating the food?
Because I wanted to use the telephone, and they said that this wasn't possible, and so I said, I'm not eating another thing until I get the telephone. And a war of attrition started, and for 10 days I went without food.
But what about the Stockholm Syndrome itself?
Well, to have Stockholm Syndrome, you have to bond with your captors. And there was no bonding. There was a lot of abuse. And in fact, when Mullah Omar released me on humanitarian grounds, I don't know who was happier to see me cross back into Pakistan, the Taliban or me.
You crossed from Kabul into Peshawar?
Yes, I was driven down to Torkham and handed over to the Pakistan authorities, who at least had the good grace and decency to accommodate me, because the representatives of the British government didn't turn up.
Why did they not?
They came up with a variety of different excuses, but, you know, I discovered that if you're in trouble, one of the worst things to have in your possession is a British passport. Because,
are you serious?
Yes, I'm serious.
People struggle all their lives to get a British passport.
Well, you know, the British government did little or nothing for me.
So do you think they betrayed you?
I wouldn't have said that they
disowned you.
Betrayed me. I think that they exploited me. I was used as a stick with which to beat the Taliban. You know, the British government was very happy to say, look at this poor English woman, you know, trapped, held by these brutal, evil people. You know, we're probably not going to see her alive again. In fact, the British government would have been delighted had I been sent home in a box, because they could have said, look, you know,
this is what their culture was.
But when I came...
So you think that you were set to release by the Taliban was a great disappointment to the British establishment?
Well, it was when I came out and said, you know, they were a nice bunch of guys and they treated me with courtesy and
respect. So they came up with the
respect.
accusation of Stockholm Syndrome. They said you fall in love with your captors.
Yes, because you can't drop bombs on nice people. And the last thing they wanted was me to come out unscathed and say, you know, hey, these guys were okay, actually. It was not what they wanted to hear. The drums of war were beating. In fact, they'd started the war. I was in Kabul when I felt the full terror of being bombed by my own country. They did not want me to come back and say nice things about my captors. What they wanted me to say were things that I would have said had I been in Abu Ghraib, had I been in Guantanamo Bay, had I been in Bagram, had I been a ghost detainee, had I been shaved, shackled, abused and thrown into an orange suit. In fact, every single thing that happened to people in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, I thought would have happened to me, which is why I often address political meetings and say, thank Allah, I was captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world and not by the Americans.
Will it be right to say that you walked out of captivity with the determination to more about this religion, to know more about this religion and these people? You thought that Islam was somehow the responsible for their good character?
Well, apart from giving my word, I also thought, you know, as a journalist, it's shocking that I am covering the Middle East and Asia and I know nothing about Islam. And how on earth can I write authoritatively about these people when I know nothing about their faith, which is obviously a way of life?
You know, at one stage, somebody asked you a question, that what is the thing that most impressed you about Islam? And you said it is the sisters. You didn't talk of brotherhood. You didn't talk of universal values. You talked of the sisters.
The sisterhood in Islam